Welcome to the Ridenauer Prize's virtual fireside chat. Today, the war on truth. My name is Randy Fertel, co-founder of the Ridenauer Prizes, and I would like to thank you for joining us this afternoon. For those who are connecting with us for the first time, the Ridenauer Prizes recognize those who persevere in acts of truth-telling that protect the public interest, promote social justice, or illuminate a more just vision of society. These prizes memorialize the spirit of fearless truth-telling that whistleblower, investigative journalist, and my good friend Ron Ridenauer reflected throughout his extraordinary life and career. Ron made his bones, as it were, by exposing the truth behind the My Lai massacre, what the military had declared a great American victory. Now, the military writes what they call after-action reports after significant battles. After the Battle of My Lai, so-called, the official report had it that 128 Viet Cong and 22 civilians had been killed in the village during a fierce firefight. In the official Stars and Stripes daily newspaper, that became U.S. infantrymen have killed 128 communists in a bloody day-long battle. The official press briefing, known by journalists as the 5 o'clock follies during the war, repeated the folly. In an action today, American Division forces killed 128 enemy near Quang Ngai City. In fact, there'd been no battle, no firefight, because no one had fired back at the Marical Charlie Company as Charlie Company swept through, lining up many villagers in a ditch, a Nazi kind of thing, as one of the perpetrators later testified. Were they Viet Cong sympathizers? Maybe. Quang Ngai Province did not support the American South Vietnamese allies. But were they well-armed Viet Cong regulars, as suggested? Not a chance. Only 4 colonial-era weapons were found, none Soviet or Chinese issue. The after-action report got the number wrong, too. Not 128, but 504, presumably all of them civilians. Many elderly, many women who were also raped, many babes in arms. They even got the name wrong. My Lai was a hamlet within the village of Song Mi. Ron's meticulous letter to Congress and the Pentagon was based on conversations he had with members of Charlie Company, some perpetrators, some who refused to participate. Ron knew instinctively that he had to get the details right, names, dates, map coordinates, so he wouldn't be ignored. He wasn't. Because of his letter, the after-action report, yellow journalism, alternative facts, call it what you will, is now on the ash bin of history. Here's a little puzzle for you. What's the difference between the Pulitzer Prizes and the Ridenauer Prizes? Well, there are two. One of them is that the Pulitzers get widely covered. The other is that behind the Pulitzer stands yellow journalism. That's where it got started. That's where the money comes from. Behind the Ridenauers stands a true American hero. Yellow journalism and alternative facts are an everyday plague now. It's important to remember that Trump didn't start it. Social media has made the plague more virulent. Now everyone can play. So today we will be focusing on the evolution of journalism and how we can begin to challenge the truths we may come across, especially when it comes to justifications for going to war and what is happening on the ground during conflict. Our moderator is Hayes Brown, writer and editor for MSNBC Daily. Our panelists are Gabrielle Settles, a reporter who covers misinformation for PolitiFacts, a partner of the Poynter Institute, and Matt Ho, our 2010 Ridenauer Truth-Telling recipient, who served 2 tours in Iraq, and then as a political advisor, senior civilian representative of the American government in Afghanistan. His 4-page resignation letter was published in the Washington Post in October 2009. Seymour Hersh, who got his Pulitzer for his coverage of My Lai, said in introducing Matt, If you can't do anything this week, read his letter. I'll post a link to that in the chat. So take it away.
All right. So first of all, thank you for that great introduction, and thank you all out there who are watching, and thank you, Gabrielle and Matt, for joining me today in this conversation. So I think it's really interesting to connect the story of My Lai behind the written out prizes with what is going on in journalism today, especially since in My Lai, there was an official narrative which was repeated extremely credulously, but eventually the truth did come out. These days, I feel like there are two fronts. There's the official narrative, and then there's the sort of narrative that can be told on social media and just spread in terms of disinformation. And a lot of times journalists are caught in the middle between these two like competing forces, what it is the government and the state is saying versus what the randoms are saying and what the populace really believes. And journalists are trying to figure out what the truth is between those two things. So that's what I want to talk to you guys about today. So Gabrielle, I want to start with you. First of all, as a fellow Michigander, shout out Wayne State, where you went.
Hey.
Um,
Go Warriors.
so I would love if you could walk us really quickly through your process working at PolitiFact for both finding items to fact check and the actual methods you use to verify or debunk some of the claims that you see.
Right. So PolitiFact is made up of a few core teams, and the team that I'm a part of is called the Misinformation team. So we're partners with the International Fact Checking Network, and Facebook is a partner of ours as well. So when it comes to the Misinformation team, we have a special dashboard where we're able to go and look at social media posts that have gained a lot of traction, like a lot of shares and a lot of attention, but that hold an element of misinformation, whether it's completely or there's some missing context. So what we're able to do is to go through that dashboard and take a look at these posts, and then after we select one, for example, I'll use something that I did recently. There was a blog post being shared on Facebook of saying that Putin had beheaded 12 bioweapon engineers in Ukraine. You would think with all the brutality that's being reported in the war right now that sounds like something that may have happened. So in fact checking that post, I looked at who was reporting it and used what we use in fact checking called lateral search. So when you're looking at a post, keep that tab open and then open up another Google tab and start searching more background information about that claim that you're seeing. Who is the person or the speaker, if you will, behind that post? In this case, it was a blog called Real Raw News. We have fact checked them numerous times before because they have been known to share completely made up stories, to put it bluntly, about politicians who have either been, quote, arrested or killed by the military. So, that's a clue right there that would show you, okay, this probably isn't true. And then also, the blog post stated that Putin called former President Trump right after the executions to talk about it. And that's something that really doesn't sound credible.
Right.
So in lateral search, you would search out this story or you would search out this claim. Who else has been reporting it? One clue was that this wasn't a widely known story at all, which is, for a claim like that, if it was true, you would think it would be. So that's one tool that we use. And then, we continue, to lateral search just to find out the information. And, we also interview expert sources as well. So for whatever the claim is, we'll go to that expert source in that particular field and say, hey, can you tell me more about this? And they're able to provide context about it. And, lateral search is something that not only we do as journalists, but, you at home, you guys can do it as well.
I love that. Matt, that actually sprung something in my mind. So I one of the things that is interesting is how a lot of the misinformation that spreads these days, it spreads because it sounds credible. It sounds, reasonable that, there would be, that Putin would do something like this on the battlefield. I'm wondering, Matt, if you could talk a little bit about how, whether you think that the U.S. is doing, the U.S. military in particular, through its actions, through some of the secrets that it keeps, helps propagate this climate where people are willing to believe some truly wild things that they just read online.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Oh, actually, sorry, I was asking Matt about that one.
I was going to say I was going to pass to Matthew actually, so that's perfect.
Hey, teamwork, right? Yeah, no, absolutely. That's part of the mission of various elements of the armed forces, particularly when you get into media operations and psychological warfare. I just had a journalist friend of mine the other day. He was going through who is the Pentagon paying money to, and he found that the United States Special Operations Command was giving money to contractors, actually the company that used to be called Blackwater, to train the Ukrainian military in media. And he said, what does this mean? And I said, well, it could really mean anything. I mean, all you have is the invoice. It could be very banal. It could mean like they're teaching them how to do press releases, right? I mean, they're teaching their people, what do you say to a journalist? Go talk to the public affairs officer. That's what you're teaching. It could be a little more aggressive with that, where they're teaching them how, okay, this is how we got the media to kind of really cover our stories well. This is how we handled it when they didn't cover our things well. Here's a carrot and stick type of thing. Well, hey, if we like a journalist, we make sure we invite them back and make sure they get a helicopter ride with General Petraeus. And if we don't like them, they never have access to us ever again. Or it could be, and remember, psychological warfare, it's like is part of it. It could be the false flag kind of stuff. And we know that exists. That's happened. It exists. All sides and all conflicts do it to a degree. The role of the military in this is to achieve their objective. And a lot of times that's political, and a lot of times that's media. So to utilize the media to look, they came out of Vietnam, the Pentagon. I remember General Petraeus writes his PhD thesis, a good part on this. He writes a thesis on lessons learned, and a good part of it about media. And one of the things that the Pentagon comes away with after Vietnam is that we can't have the media be our adversary. We can't have the media be the enemy that we're pointing our fingers at, saying they're the ones who lost the war for us. But we could actually have a cooperative relationship with them. Right. And in many ways, the Pentagon has gotten to the point where it is I would say even a coercive relationship. Again, a carrot and stick kind of thing. But certainly, if you look at the way the Pentagon has handled the media in terms of helping, in terms of assisting, in terms of building relationships, it's very much different than it was, say, like during the Vietnam War.
Right. Let me follow up on that really quickly, because you served in Iraq from 2004 to 2007, first as a Marine, then as a DoD civilian. What was your level of contact with embedded journalists at the time? And for people who might not be familiar with the term at this point, this was journalists who were specifically sanctioned by the military to go along with the military operations, to be on bases, to really be sort of in the thick of things.
Yeah, and actually before I went to Iraq, I was in the Pentagon. I was in the Secretary of the Navy's office, and our office was right across the hall from the Secretary's public affairs people. And one of them I knew pretty well, and they were telling me about this great program we have. We're going to send journalists to boot camp, and then we're going to link them up with various units and this embedding program, and really, develop this relationship that would be, as they would argue, beneficial for both sides, and as I would argue, became something that the Pentagon was able to capture journalists. Look, you put a journalist with 30 young men and women for months. They're going to learn to love those. They're going to love those kids. How are they going to write anything bad? That was kind of the thinking that went behind it, as well as these people want access. They're going to have to play by the rules, and we saw that over and over again. I actually was in Iraq first on a State Department team, and that's where I had most contact with the media. They would come through on different tours. They would come through with VIPs. They would come through with other experts, and you would give them, as we would call it, the dog and pony show. You would take them someplace where you knew everything was going to go well. It was manufactured, because it just was simply, look, Chris Hedges, who was the New York Times Middle East bureau chief for a while, and who, when he covered the first Iraq war, coming called the Gulf War in 1990, 1901, he said, screw that. I'm not going with the military. I'm doing my own thing. He and his translator, I guess, I know he spoke Arabic, so I don't know who he was with, but we're just going to drive into Kuwait ourselves and do our journalism directly. And they got captured by the Iraqi army. And, he was scared for his life. So that wasn't an option. You had to go through the military to a great degree. So, that's what I saw, was that we were able to control what the media saw, when they saw it, how they saw it, who they talked to, on and on and on, so that the what they were reporting, it was obvious. You roll back to World War II or World War I, when the U.S. government would actually censor the press.
Right.
This was actually, we were censoring it before it was even created.
Wow. And I feel like one of the things that's been interesting about the spread of social media since then has been the ability to counter that official narrative. Like I very naively thought, when Facebook was first blowing up, when we had the Arab Spring in 2010, that, social media was going to be this great leveler, but also be a really good way for a two-way flow of information between governments and the people. And so, whoops, I suppose. But on, as far as social media platforms go, Gabrielle, I wanted to ask you, which platform, from your experience, I guess, which has been the one that is the worst in terms of spreading the sort of misinformation that you have to correct? And I have a follow-up to that, but I'm just curious to know, like, what your answer is off the top.
Ooh, I have fact-checked claims that have come from Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Gosh, they're all, it's interesting because I've seen claims that are, gravely untrue on each of these platforms. So I can't say one specifically is the worst, at least today.
So when you do come across these things, though, on the platforms, how much of the fact that they're taking off would you say is because of the algorithms that are behind these platforms, behind like the Facebook algorithm, the TikTok algorithm, pushing these things on people, and how much of it is the producers of this content knowing what it is that people want to see?
So that's interesting because I think one of my editors who really is on the lines in terms of looking at the algorithms could speak a little better towards that, but I think it's a mix of both in terms of what I see. So claims that are wildly popular, those get more shares. More shares means it goes out to more people. For example, with TikTok, if you're looking at a particular type of video, TikTok will continue to show you that type of content. So if you're looking at stuff about Ukraine, more of those videos are going to pop up, and chances are there's some misinformation that's going to show up in there too. We did a very in-depth story. My co-reporter Bill McCarthy did a huge story on that, of just how easy it is for people to share videos that are false and pretend or to misconstrue it as if it's on the front lines or on the ground in Ukraine. In actuality, it was an old video, or it's a video of a completely different conflict, such as Afghanistan.
Right.
But some users will upload these posts and on top of that put a piece of audio on top of it, and that makes it more popular, and therefore it's going out to more people. So I've seen that across the board in terms of both TikTok and Facebook, and Instagram as well. But to me, when something is very popular and it's something that people want to see and they click on, the more interactions, the more widely shared it'll be.
So just stick with you for a second, Gabrielle. I'm curious. I'm fascinated by the work of fact checkers. In general, I've worked with some really good ones. In the past, I worked at BuzzFeed News before, which
Yeah.
is amazing at finding the things that are going viral online, saying like, no, these are things that you need to like watch out for. What I'm curious, what is the piece that has been the heart of misinformation that you've come across? Has been the hardest to fact check so far? To be like, okay, I really am struggling to figure out whether this is true or not.
I think before fact checking, before becoming a fact checker, this was when COVID had just hit. And I think that had I not been a fact checker at the time, I probably would have believed some misinformation that's out there right now in terms of about the vaccine specifically. So there is a public database that's run by the CDC. It's called yes. It's called the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. You guys know it. Okay, cool.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah. And so people are able to publicly report an adverse health event that has happened after having a vaccine. But the trouble with VAERS is that it doesn't verify whether or not that vaccine really caused that adverse health event. It just shows this person had a vaccine, they had this X event. So people will go on to VAERS and then, take this raw and unverified data, which the CDC has warned people about, or people against, rather, I should say. People will go on to VAERS and take that raw, unverified data and then share it on social media and say the COVID-19 vaccine is terrible. It's killing thousands, if not millions of people, or it's rendering people incredibly ill. And so you have all of these really wild claims that people believe. And I think part of it is due to fear. This is a pandemic that, of course, we've never lived in before. And so there's a lot of fear around what is safe for my body and what is not. And so I can understand how people may believe the misinformation out there about the vaccine, especially if they haven't done a lot of research themselves on, how safe it is. And it is safe and effective. So I would say those are the hardest to fact check because, the evidence and the information is out there, and I can talk to as many wonderful experts as possible who give their time, and they're on the front lines as well in terms of medicine and saving people's lives. But will you, as the reader, believe it? Because I'm going to continue to do as much as I can, but it's up to you to actually believe it and then check out that information for yourself.
That's really interesting, especially I feel like considering that there are so many things when it comes to, I feel like the science of the pandemic, you can't run like these tests yourself. And also then when it comes to national security, there are some things out there that you can't really do your own research. You can't really verify yourself, like whether or not, claims about, deaths in a war are real. You have to trust the sources that you are able to go to. And so Matt, on that front, I find I have read your 4-page resignation letter, which again is linked in the chat right now. Randy posted there. When you resigned, you said, for people who haven't read, you said that one of the things that you were trying to correct was basically government misinformation about how the war in Afghanistan was going. And I saw a more recent interview that you did where you straight up called some of the things that the government was saying were lies. What do you see as some of the biggest lies that were told about Afghanistan? And I guess how should people think about the idea that there is an official misinformation in a way coming from their government?
Well, it's just not me. I think, if you go back to Vietnam, and Randy was talking about Ron Ridenour and My Lai, and then, Nick Turse, who is a Ridenour Prize winner who won for his book, Kill Everything That Moves. Nick found that there is more or less a My Lai massacre every week in Vietnam. That was the reality of it. And you talk, Vietnam vets, you talk to them and they will tell you, yeah, man, that was it. Reason why, U.S. Army infantry units mutinied in the last 3 years of the war continually was one, they didn't want to get killed, in a war they didn't believe in, but also two, they didn't want to kill for a war, but even in modern times, you look at the, look, I'll give a lot of credit to our friends in Great Britain. They've had 2 parliamentary inquiries on both the Iraq War and the Libyan War, in the sense that parliamentary inquiries that found both of those wars were based upon lies. The Afghan papers, which were published by the Washington Post in December of 2019, which is a trove of thousands of pages of documents from interviews of between 400 and 600 U.S. officials and military officers. One big lie. The war was, and I mean that's the nature of warfare. That's the reality of it. I think what it was that the continual way that one successive rotation of officers, of diplomats, of politicians would lie. That the Obama administration was no different than the Bush administration, and the Trump administration was no different than when it came to talking about these wars, about the reality of the wars, what was happening, who we were partnering with. I mean, we could be here all day talking about the specific lies, but one is the drug trade in Afghanistan. The idea that somehow it was Taliban controlled, completely untrue. Completely untrue. The people who controlled the drug trade were our partners in the Afghan government. I mean, like that was as clear as anything, and journalists would report it. The New York Times would write extensively on this, I mean, various, but when it came to the idea that there was this narco terror link and that we were right, it just went with it. Or like we're at, the poppy fields, that's where the Taliban get all their money from. And, even then too, things we knew about where the Taliban got their money from. Well, and as it's now as the United Nations reported last year, source of money the Taliban got from the poppies, from the heroin, was always low, which was something we knew, which was something that was released by WikiLeaks and others. But even when I was there, I knew that the top 5 funders for the Taliban were the 5th one was the poppies, the heroin, and then it was siphoning of contracts from the U.S. government. Then it was from the Pakistanis. So it was 4, I think, from the Pakistanis. But the biggest supporter of the Taliban financially were our allies in Saudi Arabia and Qatar and the United Arab Emirates. I mean, this is what we knew, I mean, so like it's that like that. And then I could go across the board on other things too. So it was just those big lies that made sense that like, okay, well, what we're fighting for here. But no, that stuff wasn't there. So it was, those kinds of things.
Yeah. So you mentioned WikiLeaks, which is interesting because I do want to ask you where you think, the line should be as far as government disclosure is concerned when it does come to national security matters. Yeah. Because I remember when, WikiLeaks was releasing the first set of documents that were basically, on, think on the military. And, like, for example, the Baghdad helicopter shooting that happened in 2007. I was like, okay, yes, this makes sense. But then the second trove that WikiLeaks released, which is more about diplomatic cables, it's like, this feels weirder to me. So I'm wondering what your thinking is on what that line should be in terms of government disclosure and transparency when it comes to national security and diplomacy matters. Like, should there be a line where you say, well, okay, it is fair that this is more close held by the government versus the idea that no, the government should be as transparent as possible about everything?
I mean, I'm really in the camp of the latter. I mean, I go back to what Neil Shaheen said about the Pentagon Papers from Vietnam, and Neil Shaheen, the New York Times journalist, and whose book A Bright Shining Lie is one of the best books on Vietnam. Not just one of the best books about Vietnam, but also one of the best books about these wars. When people ask me what books should I read to understand the Iraq and Afghan wars, I tell them books that were written about Vietnam, because the same truths hold. Change the names, change the dates, change the locations, but the truths hold. What Shaheen said was, what he said was that, what I learned about secrecy, about Pentagon secrets, government secrets, is that they're not meant to protect the American people from enemies, but from protecting the government from the people's knowledge about embarrassments and humiliations and mess ups, and so I tend to look. I was on MSNBC to talk about the helicopter shooting video, the collateral murder video, whatever we call it, And I remember being asked by the host, "What's your reaction to this?" And honestly, my reaction was, "What do you think we were doing over there? Why are people so shocked? What did you think was happening there for the last, 6.5 years or 7 years or however many it had been at that point?" I mean, things like that occurred all the time, and that's why I think the coverage in Ukraine is so important and so great, because it's showing what the war really looks like. I get upset when it gets colored in a "they do this, we don't do this" type of, or like there's a good versus evil. No, it's all evil. There's no good side in any of this. I'm not saying I'm not in favor of people fighting against occupation. I certainly am. However, but the understanding of war, its nature, what it actually is, this is what it looks like. So the fact that so many people I think it was 2010 when the video was released, were shocked that a helicopter gunning down children, shooting an ambulance, killing journalists, it happened all the time. I will say that in my 3 times at war, as well as what I did in the Pentagon and at the State Department, my estimation is for every civilian casualty incident that we are aware of, there are at least 3 or 4 or 5, maybe more, that we never, ever will hear about. I mean, that's just so whenever you hear these casualty counts, I automatically, I mean, I could tell you individual stories. I mean, I took part in a thing where one of our Apaches, same type of helicopter that killed people in Baghdad, killed people in Zabul in 2009, massacred the better parts of 2 families, right? And no one knows about that, right?
Right. So one of the things that's been most interesting about Ukraine, to pivot back to that, I think, is we've seen, for example, in Bucha, the suburb outside of Kyiv, where the Russian army, as they retreated, the Ukrainians have discovered bodies in the streets with their hands tied and other mass graves and other sort of atrocities that had occurred. But if you look at the Russian coverage, I mean, I assumed when we first started hearing about that the Russians would, do what the US does, which is suppress these sort of like embarrassing sort of details. But instead, they've been putting them out there and saying that they are lies, that they are misinformation. And I think that is just a really interesting difference in how these things work. So while Gabrielle is getting her computer charged, Matt, I was wondering what your thoughts are on this very Russian-seeming tactic, I guess, of acknowledging that these atrocities occurred, but either saying that they were completely fabricated, or that they were actually the Ukrainians doing it, and this next level of misinformation compared to just suppressing.
Trying to like gaslight or kind of get one step ahead, right? Of like, I'm playing the proverbial 3D chess we heard so much about with like the Trump administration, right? Oh, that's what these guys are doing. They're 2 or 3 moves ahead of you. That nonsense. I'll say we do the same. The United States does the same thing. When the United States killed that family in August with the drone strike, the first thing was, well, they were killed by secondary explosions from the bombs that were in the car. So there's, I think all sides do that. But I think your point about the Russians taking it to a next level, I think that has a lot to do too with the control of Russian media, where they have they have a very firm. They closed a lot of whatever independent networks there were in Russia have been closed. There's a censorship on the internet that we fortunately don't experience. We experience censorship. Like, I'm not excited that Elon Musk may be buying Twitter, however, but the censorship we have is different than what they have. And I don't know if it makes sense to argue if any's better, or worse. Right. But, so I think that their formulation, though, and the way they can control it allows them to make ridiculous claims because they feel like it's not going to hurt them. So just deny it. And, with the atrocities, and again, I'm very glad at the scale of the media attention. Of course, I wish the same attention was being given to Yemen or given to Ethiopia right now, given to Palestine, what has the scale or what had occurred in Syria, in Libya, and Iraq. It's on and on and on. But I think what it does is it shows people the reality of warfare. The fact that no matter what is being done, people are going to suffer in cruel and inhumane ways. And that is a truth to it. That's a truth that exists, just like as it's a law of nature, a law of physics. It applies to everybody. Look, gravity applies to me just as much as it applies to, to Vladimir Putin or Volodymyr Zelensky. You know, I mean, the same thing too. The realities of war apply to, and that's, I think we shouldn't be surprised, is what I'm trying to say, that the Russians are. Look, they launched. There's a lot of context. Love to talk about it. Of what led up to this. One of the things I get upset about with the Ukrainian coverage is that it tends to sound like the war started in February. That 15,000 people hadn't been killed in fighting in eastern Ukraine before that, as well as like all the other things, including, the very possibility, the very real of a U.S. coup in 2014 or a U.S. backed coup. All these things that can lead up. That's not saying that Russia had any right to invade. In the post-Nuremberg War, they committed a war crime by launching a preemptive invasion. That's clear. It's over. It's done. And of course, any invasion and occupation, the cruelty of the barbarity that comes from it. But yeah, it is interesting to see their response. It's certainly not as sophisticated, I guess, as the Western response would be.
So, Gabrielle, welcome back.
I got the notification. I'm like, oh, no, you don't.
Good save. So to pivot off of this really quickly, I feel like one of the things that is also fascinating to watch is how in the Ukraine conflict, Russia is just so completely willing to discredit and dismiss any sort of fact-checking from Western, organizations or outlets. I feel like that is an extreme version, though, of some of the pushback that we've seen against fact checkers here in the US over the last few years. And the idea that, well, fact checkers, including like the international group that you work with, who works with Facebook specifically to help flag things as being, misinformation or untrue, etc., that they themselves are in fact biased and are unable to fairly call balls and strikes, I guess, on what is true and what isn't. What is your defense? Like, what's your pushback against that notion that, fact checkers themselves can't be trusted because you hold your own biases?
Yeah, that's hard. I think people who do say that or believe that, fact checkers are biased, we're the ones who speak to the experts, so, going back to COVID-19 and going back to vaccines, that's not necessarily us saying vaccines are good. We're actually talking to medical doctors and medical professors who are explaining why vaccines are effective. So in terms of, when people say fact checkers can't be trusted, well, in some ways they're also saying that the experts we talk to can't be trusted. And so that's unfortunate. And people do believe, some people do believe what they want to. But I think if they take a good look at what we do, specifically for PolitiFact, we're very open and very transparent about our sources. So at the end of each article, we'll put a source list. Who have we talked to? What day did we talk to them? Through what method did we talk to them? Whether it was a phone interview or an email interview. And it's just that extra step of transparency that, that will show our readers we are who we say we are. We speak the truth. And we also fact check in terms of strictly politics. We do fact check both sides. So, just recently I fact checked somebody from Occupy Democrats about a claim, or fact checking someone who is a Republican about a claim. And it's never to specifically go after a person. It's about the specific claim itself and presenting the context in which people can understand whether it's true or untrue, and also why. So, I would say to those people, read our work and, watch our work. We also have videos as well. And, you'll see that our integrity speaks for itself.
Matt, jumping back to jumping back to like war in general and the coverage thereof and how difficult it can be to get the facts out there. Most media outlets have a desire to both be first but also be accurate, and those two things can compete sometimes. How much would you say the fog of war really affects that desire to really be accurate? And how much leeway should we give the press for getting things wrong about war when details can be murky, or the information that the journalists are getting could be, half baked?
Yeah, I think it's hard. It's hard. You're in a situation like reporting from Ukraine or you reporting from Iraq. It's just not. I mean, how many journalists have been killed in Ukraine already? I mean, like a good amount. I mean, I've lost track. And so you have to have. I think what the expectation is that the reporting is going to be corrected, and that there's going to be a consistency in the journalism, that over time you see that, right? So you expect that things are going to get reported and it's not going to be accurate. And then they're going to say, okay, this is actually what happened. This is what we're learning now. I think where it gets dangerous, though, is where you see journalists who are opining or becoming emotional. Mm-hmm. And utilizing the footage, and it's very raw, it's very visceral, very emotional. And then on top of that, saying this is what needs to be done. And you have that blurring then of opinion and news, right? You have that, which is unfortunately how a lot of the media has become, because it's entertainment. I was just listening to someone talk about Rush Limbaugh and how this really develops in the 80s, but the pulling on the heartstrings, you got to do something. We got, and there it is. It gets very complicated, but I think it gets back to, desire for journalists to be neutral and objective. And that's really hard to do, but that's why journalism is a profession, right? That's why it's a calling and it's a profession. And it's something that I think journalists and the media in general have to really own. And then, you look at, you look at the coverage coming from Ukraine, and of course things are going to be very difficult to determine what's real. One of the things I was thinking about when Gabrielle was talking was that, first of all, the equipment used on both sides in Ukraine is very often the same. And the ability now to do these deep fakes, and people see the Russian vehicles have a Z marked on them, and that Z is so that they don't get attacked by their own aircraft or by other Russian forces. It's an identifier. We do the same thing too. Our military does. And, it's I've seen these photos where you cannot tell the Z has been digitally removed or digitally added. You have no idea. And so they're using the same type of tanks, same type of armored personnel carriers, same type of planes. And so how do you know who actually shot that school? Right. And so in the same thing, you have and then you have so much information out there, that this with the atrocities that occurred in Bucha, the people say, well, look, there's satellite imagery showing this and that and the other thing, and it could have been the Russians because they were out of there by then. It takes independent journalists and then groups like Amnesty International and others to go in there and actually give that neutral and objective reporting that's necessary. Where I get upset about is when I see, I'll say, like Steve Cole's work in the New Yorker on what happened on Afghanistan last fall, where all he did was interview Americans and Afghan officials that were on the American payroll. It didn't talk to anyone on the other side, didn't talk to anyone who was a third party. That's where I think you start to really have to question, what are they doing here? You couldn't have done a Skype conversation with a Taliban official in Kabul. You could, or gone there. I mean, there's journalists there now. Al Jazeera never left. I mean, you can go there and do these things. I've had, it's that, you look at over the length of time, I think, and you get a good picture of, are they doing a good job or not? And I think for the most part, 90 some odd % of the press in Ukraine is doing not just a good job, but a very heroic one. And I think the issue is you do get some who put their emotions into it and argue that, for a course of action, as opposed to saying this is what's happening.
I hear that. Gabrielle, I want to. I've been thinking a lot about how difficult it must be sometimes to run fact checks on some of these things that Matt was talking about, like digital fakes, etc. And how hard it is to correct the narrative once it's out there. I mean, one of the fascinating things about the lead up to Russia's invading Ukraine is that the US for the first time was, I feel like, trying to put as much intelligence out there as possible about, what Russia was planning to do in order to basically preempt their narrative and preempt any sort of false flags that were going to be happening.
Mhm.
As this was happening, though, there were a lot of questions from journalists, good ones, saying, well, what's your real proof of this? And the US has to say, just trust us, which had a lot of people say, getting like Iraq war vibes, like, okay, we've been down this road before. I mean, I in hindsight, now it's clear that, they were telling the truth, but what's your thinking? What's your organization, I guess, is thinking about how to fact check some of the claims that government officials make in this sort of space where you don't have the full access to, the information that they have? Like, would you ever consider fact checking a claim like, well, the Russian government plans to stage a false flag as a provocation in Ukraine?
So for claims like that are more so quote unquote like a preview, if you will,
Mhm.
um, you can't quite fact check that because you don't have, like you said, you don't have enough information yet, or the event that they're saying has occurred hasn't occurred yet.
Mhm.
So sometimes it's better to wait until there's more information and more context available, and then you can go back and do your fact checking. So like you said, that's hard when you have a preview, or I'm trying to think of the word, something upcoming. You can't really fact check those kinds of things because, again, that just hasn't happened yet.
Mm.
But when it does, we want to report it accurately. So we'll talk to
Mhm.
not only that government official, but we'll also speak to someone else who may be an expert in that field who can give you that unbiased opinion, and who isn't, as Matthew has pointed out, they're not necessarily a part of the government, or they have had a government position, but can still give you an um, unbiased point that really helps you to understand what you're reporting. So.
Yeah, Matt, just to keep on that, I mean, do you think that the media has learned the right lessons from Iraq? And is there a danger of them trying to, much as the military does, fight the previous war when it
Yeah.
comes to trying to, like, is there a risk of overcorrection from the media going against what they claim is the official narrative? Because really quickly, I have an example of this now that I think
Yeah.
about it. Right after the 2016 election, there was the intelligence community report saying, "Well, no, we believe that Russia was behind this campaign to, push Donald Trump into office." And at the time, my editors and some reporters were like, "Well, do we really know that? Like, where's your proof?" And the proof did come out, but we were almost too skeptical at that time. So I'm wondering that what your thinking is on the idea there might be overcorrection from the media in terms of believing the official narrative, and how that risk plays in comparison to being too credulous.
I think one of the things is media is so broad right now, right? So when you say who are we talking about, And
Fair
so
enough.
my immediate response is to say, no, they haven't, because I look at, say, the Sunday morning talk shows, and I
Mm.
look at the analysis that Fairness and Accuracy and Reporting did for the Afghan withdrawal this summer, where they found that of the 22 guests that the Sunday morning talk shows had on to talk about the withdrawal from Afghanistan, 20 of them had defense industry ties
Mm.
that were all unreported, right? And then The Intercept and David Serrata's news organization, The Lever, just reported recently that the same phenomena is happening again. And actually, it's really quite crazy that you can have someone who represents the company that makes Javelin missiles go on Meet the Press and say we need to send more Javelin missiles to Ukraine. And he's not identified as being with the company that makes the whistle. He's identified as it. So if you're talking about things like that, then I say no. But then you look at the various independent journalists, the various different organizations that have stood up, the various, I would say, look, we didn't have Google News in 2003. We had it, but people, you didn't look at it on your phone. Well, you didn't have these aggregation services, right, where you could get a whole host of different sources, kind of as Gabrielle was talking about, to do the fact checking yourself. And as you said earlier on, Gabrielle, right, the lateral search. Right. And so I think that if you're the incumbency needs to be on us as the consumers. And you can give me in a whole big rant about our education system doesn't teach people how to do, right? We don't teach critical thinking. We teach what's the correct answer. And so, right, you hear from the teacher that the correct answer is Kalamazoo, and that's it. No question about it, no thinking about it. That's it. And so we can get into the whole sociological aspect of why we are like this, right? But I think it really comes back to, look, I watch for my international news, I watch Al Jazeera. I think they do a really great job, as long as it doesn't have anything to do with Qatar,
with the Gulf states. Nothing.
Exactly. They hate Saudi Arabia, so like there is, right. So you got to then take that though with an opposite grain of salt. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't know what good is really going to mean the Saudis. So, I mean, but you have, so like watching Al Jazeera for their coverage, say on what's happening in Myanmar or their coverage on Ukraine has been great, but their coverage on Syria was terrible, right? It was terrible because the Qatari government was very much involved in that war. So you've got to be I think an educated consumer. You got to be a realistic consumer. You have to look at multiple sources. Mm-hmm. And you have to see how they do consistently over time. Yeah,
great answer. Looking at viewer questions rather. Here's a good one. Matt, isn't objectivity a will of the wisp? Aren't your agendas inevitably embedded in what we see and cover? What would Vietnam look like if David Halberstam and Neil Sheehan had edited out their moral outrage?
Right. That's the whole thing. I've heard various people talk about this. I've heard Julian Assange talk about this, how really we can try and obtain neutrality and objectivity, but it's never going to happen. And that's when the professionalism comes in, right? Where, look, it's kind of in the sense that, with the Hippocratic oath for physicians of do no harm, where even if you don't like the person, you hate the person, the person is, you still have an obligation to treat them. You try and separate yourself, and that might be a more extreme example I need to describe, but like the trying to achieve that neutrality and objectivity to serve the institution of journalism and to serve your readers, your consumers, your viewers, whoever. But it's very hard. And the moral outrage, certainly, I mean, journalists I know that I think do incredible work. Say Chris Hedges, I mentioned before, Abby Martin, others. I don't think anyone is going to say that they are neutral. They have chosen a side in the sense that, like, I'm going to tell the story of the Palestinian people. I'm going to tell the story of the Ukrainian people. I'm going to tell a story of the people of Wake Forest, North Carolina. And again, and it comes back to us then, as we consume that, we have a responsibility that we're taking this, understanding who's writing it, who's producing it, who's putting it out there. How does it match up with everything else? Because so much of our news now is not so much just a straight, kind of like we're talking about earlier, where there's a house fire, and it's so much of our news. There's context, there's commentary, there's precedent, that has to be understood to understand the headlines and the facts of the day.
Well, we are coming up on towards the end of our time. So I'm going to remind viewers that if you do have a question to ask, hit the ask a question button, type it in, and we will take a look at that. While we're letting people do that, Gabrielle, I'm curious, just to get back to the broader idea of your gig, I'm wondering, is there anything that you've come across on the dashboard you mentioned earlier where it just seemed like way too out there a claim to even bother fact checking, but later on it just exploded into the consciousness and you're like, wow, I really wish I had done something on this before?
I almost passed on. I almost passed on a claim that said that the war in Ukraine is, quote, staged and scripted, and that is something that is so out there that it's, as soon as you see it, it's like, what? No, no, no.
Yeah.
Then I clicked on it and I opened it and I realized that, you know, a lot of people were actually, or people who were commenting on the video anyway, were believing it. And so this was something that, you know, I was able to pitch to my editors and just say, okay, this is, I think this is important because we can, you know, we can go into what is real about this war. And there's so much evidence that is surmounting every single day that shows this war is indeed a reality. And, you know, there are people who are suffering brutalities each and every day because of this. So here are all the examples proving that this war is absolutely real. And so I'm glad that we ended up, or rather, I ended up selecting the story to do. And so, you know, I hope it helped as many people as possible, just as a reminder to show that, you know, this is real and this is what our current events are showing as we speak. So.
Yeah, totally. I find myself running short of questions to ask you guys. So one more reminder to the audience, if you guys have any questions for our very delightful speakers, to go ahead and hit the ask a question button. And I'll give you guys another minute or two to ask. Matt, I do want to ask, I think, one final question of you, and that is, given, you know, what we are seeing in terms of the way that the war in Ukraine is being fought, you said like 90+% of it is being done well. I'm wondering, how should people think about some of, I feel like there's a tendency among some on both the left and on the right, I hate to both sides this, but there is a tendency that almost loops back around to be contrarian for the sake of being contrarian, almost, of saying like, no, I refuse to believe this thing, even though most people are willing to say, like, for example, you mentioned coverage in Syria, the idea that, you know, Assad did not use chemical weapons on his people. What do you say in terms of wanting to push back on those sort of narratives, that this sort of contrarianness for contrarianness' sake, when a lot of people are turning to this because they don't trust the quote unquote official story? Like, how would you explain to someone who sends you like a link to that sort of story, I really think you should rethink this?
Yeah, there's a. I think it's symptomatic of a larger problem we have in our society of, you know, of A versus B, red versus blue. You know, you're either for Trump or for Biden. You can't be. You know, I mean, like it's one or the other. It's very black and white. You're either watching MSNBC or you're watching Fox News. You know, and this type of this split, that means that if the United States is doing something, it must be bad. So ergo, the other side must be good. And the same thing as well. If Russia is doing something, then ergo, the United States must be good. Right. And where there actually is context, and there's, you know, and the look, I was just thinking about this today because you had that. I think we have to, how did we get to this point? And you look at what's happening in Michigan now with the trial of those men who were charged with attempting to kidnap and murder Governor Gretchen Whitmer. And, you know, as soon as that happened, people I know, primarily on the right, said, you know what, the FBI is involved in this. This is going to be bad news. There's, you know, and they have a catalog of, you know, whether it's the Ruby Ridge, whether it's Oklahoma City, 9/11, where it's not these like conspiracy things where the FBI did it, but things are left out or the whole story's not told. like say with 9/11, just to hit that big truth bomb right there, right? Just let's go with the holy mother of all internet things, right? 9/11. I think you can look at 9/11 and say, look, the CIA knew there were two Al-Qaeda operatives in the United States for 18 months, and they never told the FBI. And we've never gotten a hearing on that or an explanation for that as well. Then, too, as we learned, a couple weeks ago, the FBI is saying that the Saudi government had a 50-50 chance of knowing about the attacks before they happened. This is now coming out, and nobody is saying we need to investigate this. When that continues to happen, and there were similar things, say with Oklahoma City, with was there an informant involved? All this stuff that the answers weren't provided. It's a building block process. Right. And so not saying that, not jumping in. And that's the problem, is that if you talk about these things and you try and talk about them in a way that, okay, look, here are the parts that are missing, right? Yeah. So, I think that's a lot of it. We have to kind of look at how do we get to this point if we want to figure out how to unravel it to get to a point where we have a public that is educated and that trusts the sources, and I think the work that you guys both do is really instrumental to that.
Well, thank you for that. Since you bring up the Whitmer case, I would recommend people go to BuzzFeed News and read their reporting on the lead up to that set of arrests, because it is fascinating and nuanced and questions the idea, were these guys really super committed to the idea of kidnapping and killing Governor Whitmer? Right. So on that note, though, I want to thank you guys both for your time today. You guys have been amazing. I want to thank everyone who has been watching this for taking the time and spending it with us, talking about how we think about the truth when it comes to war and journalism. And I hope you guys follow along with the Rittenhour prizes moving forward and Pogo. Thank you guys for putting this on, and have a good day, everybody.
Thank you.